Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Anna Robinson, and I am the West Virginia Program Manager and Communications Coordinator for the One America Movement. Thank you all so much for joining us today for another episode of Candid Conversations. For those of you who don't know, Candid Conversations is a part of our new Corona Rebuild initiative, where we connect the challenges of COVID-19, the divisions in our country, and the roles we each have to play in order to move forward together. Every Friday, we'll feature someone from the One America Movement Network on our show to get candid about how the coronavirus pandemic and the divisions that have come along with it are affecting communities across the United States. We've been covering issues related to race, food insecurity, health disparities, mental health, and the conversation is still ongoing. Today, we have a special treat for you. The One America Movement staff is all here together, well, virtually. And we're going to be talking about polarization in the workplace with you guys. So do you guys want to introduce yourselves to the people?
Sure, I can go first. I'm Alden Groves. I am our Virginia Regional Coordinator here at the One America Movement, and I'm glad to be here with everyone today. It's good to see you.
Hey everyone, my name is Andrew Hanauer. I'm the President and CEO of the One America Movement. I'm really excited to be with you guys and for you all to get to see that we get to work with really cool people in this organization.
My name is Ryan Early. I'm the Operations and Development Associate, and thank you guys so much for joining us today.
Hi, everybody. I'm Chandra Denamp-Wetstein. I am the Senior Director of Programs and Operations. Glad to be with you.
And it looks like we may be having some technical difficulties, so I will introduce Heather. She is our wonderful Communications Director. So we're going to be sharing some of our stories with you guys today. We're all aware that polarization can happen anywhere, but it's what you choose to do in response to overcome it that actually matters. We want you guys to know that we all make mistakes. Sometimes we judge books by their covers. And when I say book, obviously, I mean people. But if we're able to look at ourselves and recognize toxic polarization for what it is, there's hope that we can work together to grow from it. So I wanted to start with a story where I judged a book by its cover. It's a good example of one of our science concepts, false polarization, which is where we have more in common with people than we believe. So I had the opportunity to interview our wonderful communications director, Heather, when she was interviewing for the position. And I remember my first impression of her, and we've talked about this, so don't worry, guys, there's no awkwardness about this story, okay? So when I interviewed her, I remember thinking, wow, this woman, I could tell that she came from politics, and I thought that she would be great for the organization work-wise, but I was concerned about whether or not we would actually get along, because in my mind, I had this image of her in my head where she was rigid. And looking back on it now, I'm actually kind of disappointed in myself, because I know as a woman and understand that sometimes in a professional work setting, if a woman comes across as strong, she's viewed negatively. And when a man does the same thing, he's viewed as a great leader. And I think I was playing into a bias that I didn't even realize that I had, and something that I have also experienced as a woman. And so I'm extremely disappointed in myself for this. You guys don't even understand. I've apologized to Heather so many times for this, but I ended up finding out after we started working together that Heather was not rigid at all. Is she a strong leader? Absolutely. But she's great for the organization. And she's also one of the most she's such a bubbly person, so kind, so caring. And all of the things that I had believed about her were completely false. So I'm sharing this story to tell you guys, like, hey, You know, sometimes we meet people and we have bad first impressions, but that doesn't mean that one first impression should define how you feel or what you think about a person. And I guess I want to pose the question to you guys. Have you ever had a situation where you had a negative first impression of someone and it just turned out to be completely wrong?
For sure. We don't have to go in order, but I definitely have one that jumps to mind. When I first got to college, my first day freshman year, I'd been randomly assigned a roommate from Chicago. He and I were both sort of outsiders in South Carolina. And so I remember thinking ahead of time, okay, I'm going to have one person who sort of like isn't from around here. We'll be pals. And just like one small thing the first day, his mom made a comment. We were like walking in the mailroom or something. And his mom was talking about like, oh, you guys are the same size. Now, I'm a scrawny kid. He was a competitive weightlifter, and he just had in his mind, he's like, this guy is dead to me. I hate him. I can't believe my mom just said that. And I was like, who is this meathead, and how did I get stuck with him? And so for 72 hours, it was like uncomfortable. We really didn't like each other. It was very tense in the room. And then somehow, you know, just one of those like forced to live near each other in the same room settings. We stayed up till 3 a.m, sort of talking about our lives, and he ended up being my best man. I ended up being his best man. But very much at the start, I was like, this is going to be the worst roommate situation ever. Can I transfer after a semester? So
That's great.
You never know.
I also have a first impression story. My husband and I met online. We were online dating because, you know, that's the cool thing to do. And when he first messaged me, I kid you not, this man's profile picture was a picture of him standing up playing video games. He has a controller in his hand and a snake around his neck and looked like the world's biggest nerd. And I almost didn't want to meet him, but like he was funny when we started talking, and then I saw him in person and I was like, whoa, not a nerd, so handsome. So, I mean, I'm glad I didn't judge that. We've been married 10 years. It worked out okay.
Was it an actual snake around his neck or a fake one?
Yes, it was a snake. And I actually don't know where that snake came from because he doesn't own one. And I haven't asked whose snake it is. So I should probably figure that out.
Wow.
Yeah, you should probably look into that one.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
I think that's great though, because you ended up marrying this guy, so it all worked out.
You're here.
Heather, you actually have a story that is kind of like the flip side of mine, and it's kind of like you telling us how you were experiencing your very first days, and it's going to be focused on motive misattribution. So why don't you tell us your story?
Uh-oh.
Oh, I think she's back.
She's building
Okay,
a suspense for a story.
I love hearing the story that Anna tells because I don't think ever in my life anybody has ever like thought I came across as like rigid, and I'm tickled pink about it because I will say when I was interviewing for this position, I felt that pressure that Anna talks about. As a professional woman, you've got to be well-spoken and serious and well-dressed and in control of your emotions, and you can't joke and you can't feel and you can't do all of these things. So coming in, I told myself, okay, I'm going to do it. I'm going to be a super professional woman. We're going to come in. And apparently that came off as rigid, which I could see now. But I remember the first day I started with this job, we're in the middle of a pandemic. I have 4 children at home. And I threatened each of them. I was like, you have to be quiet. You have to stay away from me. You can't knock on the door. You can't cry. You can't hurt yourself. Like, you just got to be chill because I can't let them see that I have children. And I can't let them see that I'm a real normal person. I've got to be super professional. So we roll in, and I was stressed that whole first couple of days trying to be the best version of myself possible. And I know that I'm qualified for this position. I know that I can really do a good job with it. But that people element, if you don't know the culture, you don't know what to expect, and it's scary. So funny story, actually, my boss, who is on this call, it must have been the second day at work. I had done something over lunch, and I popped back in and said, oh, over the lunch hour, I did such and such a thing. And he responded via email, dead serious. Who said you could take a lunch break for an hour? And I was like, okay, wait a minute. If I had sent that email, it's for sure a joke. Like, that's like the funniest thing ever. It's a little mean, it's a little biting, it's a little dry, but it's hilarious. But I was like, okay, but wait, this is my boss. Is he mad? Like, what is the lunchroom policy? I don't know the lunch policy. I don't know what the breaks are. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. And I fretted over it for like a good hour, probably worried about this message. And it wasn't until we got into a group meeting later that day where we're all talking and this organization talks about their feelings, which also very professional women are not supposed to do, but you guys did, and it was great. But we're in the meeting, and Andy's little boy comes running over and gets in the screen, and he smiles and he laughs. And I was like, I could feel just myself deflate. I could feel the stress leave. I was like, oh, okay. That's the kind of organization this is. We're a family. We joke. We have families. We're real people. And like from then on, I felt like I could thrive here. But that first couple of days, trying to decipher what each person's motives were when they were reaching out and talking to me was very difficult.
Yeah.
I wasn't joking about the lunch break.
Yeah, I mean, it put me through the ringer for a moment.
Oh, man.
Yeah, I mean, and coming into any new situation is difficult for sure, for sure. Do you guys have any stories similar to Heather's where you maybe came into a new situation or a new job and you had like these preconceived ideas in your head of who you were supposed to be or who the other people that you were working with or meeting with were? I mean, we all have had stories like this where we've come into new situations and had expectations that were just not really in line with the actual situation.
I feel like that happens a lot. I mean, for me, it definitely happens anytime I'm starting a new job or doing a new thing with my kids and like their school or their Cub Scouts or something. You know, everywhere you go, you're supposed to have a certain, you know, persona put on. Like if I'm at Cub Scouts, then I need to be the den leader with the hat and the book and, you know, doing all the things just right and like homemade organic cupcakes and all of that stuff. And so you kind of get yourself in a position where if you're putting on something that isn't 100% you, then you're looking at other people in a way that isn't 100% going to be them. And you're making assumptions about what they're thinking about you because you're trying so hard to put on this, you know, this most perfect face for everyone. So I definitely have been in similar situations, Heather, definitely.
Yeah,
I've definitely learned through this work to like check myself and know like when I'm reading something, I can't put my own motives behind it. I can't read into what other people are doing. I've got to give them the chance to show me who they are and what they're trying to say.
Yes, yes. Benefit of the doubt. Everyone deserves it, right? So speaking of Andy and his kid and putting on a persona because we're concerned about how other people are going to view us, he has a story to tell about how difficult it's been to be a leader, to be the boss in such a trying time in U.S. history. And Andy's story is going to be focused on meta-perceptions.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. So, I mean, meta-perceptions are like all these words that we're throwing out there. They sound wonky, but they're really basic. I mean, meta-perception is what happens every time you go on a first date. It's what happens every time you have a job interview, right? You're sitting there thinking, in Alden's case, I guess, very much relaxed, thinking, what does this other person think of? What do I think this other person thinks of me, right? And I think one of the things that we see from that is that we can start to make decisions based on what we think other people are thinking about us instead of based on what's right or where our heart tells us to go. And I definitely experienced that this year. You know, during the pandemic has been difficult enough in terms of you know, testing leadership skills and having to be innovative and things like that. But in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, you know, we have a very diverse staff in terms of all sorts of different things, including political ideology. We have a board that is very diverse racially, religiously, politically. And so there were a lot of different opinions about how best to respond. And we happened to have board meetings the week after the murder. And so it was right in the middle of it. And so we're trying to decide as a staff, as an organization, how do we respond? And how does the board want us to respond? And how do our staff members want to respond? And I think that the interesting thing and the thing about meta-perceptions was I found myself, instead of thinking what is the right thing to do, I started to catch myself thinking, what are other people thinking of us based on how we respond? And I think there's a line there, right? Because you want to hear other people's perspectives so that you can strengthen your own understanding of a situation, especially when, in my case, in this instance, the situation is affecting a community that I'm not a part of. And at the same time, you want to be able to actually base decisions based on what's right and not just what you perceive other people are thinking of you, especially since your perceptions are often wrong. And so it was a really interesting example, I think, of how do you make sure that you're not creating this image in your head that may not even be right about how people you've never met are viewing you. And when in most cases, they may not even know you exist. So that's my meta perception story.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. I think, I'm going to give I have a situation where that I've kind of fallen victim to that, but then I'll pose the question to you guys. So I think specifically when it comes to the whole George Floyd situation, I think for a really long time, I stayed quiet. I avoided being vocal about some of these issues that we've been discussing lately because I was really afraid that people were going to view me negatively or think that I was the angry Black woman or, just make judgments about me because of this. But I think having the support of such a great staff we had very serious discussions about this issue and I felt like my voice was heard. And it made me feel a little bit more comfortable. It made me realize, like, why am I holding myself back and holding back how I feel about something so important? Because I'm worried about what other people are going to think or say, especially an issue like this where I don't think there's a good side to murder. So, I mean, it's but anyway, I'm really grateful for the staff the staff culture that we have that allowed me to kind of free myself from that, because falling victim to that is not good or healthy at all. Have you guys ever made a decision or decided to not do something based on how you thought people would view you?
Definitely for me. I think going along with like the sort of the racial justice, movement right now that sort of picked up some steam. I think that by me not posting every day on the internet or me not saying the certain things, me not posting something because I felt like my friends would harp on it because they'd nitpick and find this nuance and say that I'm wrong. And all I want to do is actually support, the fight for racial equality and police accountability and things like that. So it takes me like 30 minutes to post something online because I always think about what other people are going to say about it, or if I'm going to have to get into a Facebook, fight or something for like 2 hours. So I tend to hold back a little bit unless I'm really sure I'm ready to get into it. But
it's such a great example, right? It's that someone told me the other day that when you type something into Facebook and then delete it, Facebook still knows what you typed, which is terrifying.
Oh, wow.
Because we all do that, right? Because we're all sitting there typing and then asking ourselves, wait, what are other people going to think of me when I hit send or submit or post or whatever the word is? And I think that, we have this culture now that increasingly is unforgiving of anyone, not even just for things that are really bad like racism, but for people just saying things the wrong way or using the wrong word. And I think that that's a huge problem because it makes people so scared to speak that we get a lot of silence where we could have, I think, a much, much better conversation.
Very true. And I think that this unforgiving culture is what leads to our next topic, which is toxic polarization. And Chandra, you have a story to tell about a situation where you maybe perceived something, but it maybe wasn't the right thing. Or why don't you tell us about that?
Sure, yeah. So my story is about toxic polarization. And, for One America, what that means for us is the kind of polarization that tears societies apart rather than being the kind of polarization that happens in a healthy society. So in a healthy society, people disagree all the time. They disagree about ideas. They disagree about policies. They disagree because of their experiences, right? But when those disagreements change from being about what you believe and start being about who you are, and I disagree with that person because I know they're a part of this group that opposes my group, well, then that's where we start to get into trouble, right? And so I should preface my story by saying that I consider myself to be a progressive liberal Christian. And the story takes place right in the beginning of whenever I was working with One America. And I was invited to participate in this call with a group of conservative pastors. And at one point in the call, one of the pastors was talking about the word evangelical. And he said that really evangelical folks don't necessarily use the word evangelical because they just consider themselves to be Christians. And so the word evangelical doesn't resonate with them because to them, they're just Christians. And so in my mind, you know, as someone who identifies as being a liberal, progressive Christian, I kind of went, wait a second here. Like, is this guy saying that if you don't ascribe to the kind of evangelical worldview, then you're not really a real Christian, and that only evangelical folks fit into really being able to call themselves Christian? So I could kind of feel my blood pressure was rising a little bit, right? I kind of got my hackles up. It was a good thing it wasn't a video call because I was kind of like making one of these like faces, right? And looking back at it now, I know like there's nothing about what he said that he actually said that should have led me to believe that he was, you know, saying anything against me or my group at all. But because I had kind of come into the situation kind of front loading my liberal progressive Christianity, knowing that these were going to be more conservative pastors, that kind of primed me to think in this way. And so what I've really learned over the time that I've been working at One America is how to develop my own kind of toxic polarization internal barometer. And so when I start feeling myself to get heated, or maybe I'm judging someone with a snap judgment, or maybe I'm making assumptions about someone, whenever I'm really, you know, primed and ready to fight, whether that's like in a work situation or on social media or with my more conservative family, then my polarization barometer goes off and says, Chandra, you know, you better watch yourself because you are being influenced by toxic polarization. Like, is your reaction really in line with your deepest values? And if it's not, then you better change what you're about to say or do.
Yeah. So do you guys have toxic polarization barometers? And if so, how do you utilize them? How do you fix, or how do you look at yourself in a situation where you might be experiencing toxic polarization, or projecting onto someone else? How do you handle that?
First, can I just say we should sell toxic polarization barometers for $29.99. We wouldn't need any more grants. We would be funded, or we're good.
You just gave away a really great idea on a live stream.
Uh-oh.
This isn't super specific, but I definitely will try to every so often step back and say, hey, what am I defining my group as? And are there any ways in which I differ from what this group thinks, believes, says, whatever? Because if not, that's important to look at and say, well, do I just ascribe to all of those things because it's the group line, or because I really, really believe those? And sometimes there are things that's like, yeah, I believe these. That's why I'm part of this group. And sometimes there are things that can come up that you just sort of absorb because they're part of the water you're swimming in. And I just think that's important to do some self-reflection every so often about why you, like, if you are in total lockstep with everyone else in your group, that's something to just consider more deeply.
Right.
Yeah, definitely.
I think it's really interesting, and I wish a barometer is something that I could buy, because it's such a learned skill to be able to see these things in the world around you. Until I came to this organization, I couldn't put my finger on what it was about the things that I was hearing and the things that my group was participating in that bothered me so much. I came from the world of politics, and a lot of times on a political campaign or in a race, the ends always justify the means, and it doesn't matter what you say, really, as long as you get people to vote on your side. And so much of that messaging ends up being this big, broad painted strokes about how bad the other side is and how dangerous they are and how they all believe the same thing. And the reality is if I sit down and I talk to somebody from whatever persuasion or religion, there's almost always something that we can find in common. And we have a lot of the same concerns and the same worries and the same values. And there might be a different way of approaching the issue, but not so different that I can't talk to you or get along with you. So I think pulling back that knee-jerk reaction of, whoa, we can't have this conversation, your values are not the same as mine, to a place where I could say, oh, why do you say that thing? How did you get to this place? And then finding that common ground.
Yeah, I think that actually kind of brings us into our next story, which talks about not just values, but sacred values. Alden, you have a story where you kind of had a knee-jerk reaction to something, right? And you had to take a step back and really self-reflect. Why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, for sure. And just quickly tagging on to what Heather said there, I wanted to share a quote that I found helpful. I can't remember who said it, but somebody said, if you're going to learn something today, it won't be from you. So just that sense of like, if you're only spending time around people who are just like you, you're not learning stuff. Anyway, so yeah, sacred values, I think have really stood out to me among the topics that we talk about and consider in our work. I mean, there's so many helpful terms that you all have covered already. To just give a quick intro to sacred values, I'll use the one that Andy loves to do to get me to make fun of my own sports teams. But this idea is that there's some things that are sort of, we can flex on. So I'm from Philadelphia, I'm an Eagles fan. There is a dollar number you could pay me to burn an Eagles jersey on national television. It's not $1, but there is a figure.
How much? $10?
A little more than that, but anyway, but like, you know, for me as a Christian, there is $0 figure. There's no money that you could give me that would be enough to convince me to renounce my faith on national television, because it's just in a different category for me. It's this really important sacred belief that I have. And we actually have learned from some of our neuroscience partners that the way you process those things in your brain, if something's in the sacred value category, we process it as if when somebody questions it, attacks it, whatever, it's like somebody swinging a weapon at you. You just sort of have that flinch reaction. You don't hear it in the same way in the sort of logical, rational, so on and so forth. So I had this experience that Anna, you were mentioning, where after one of our events, I was on sort of a debrief call with some leaders within One America stuff, and some of them were, you know, talking about how the event went, and there was one participant who came up who sort of had said some off-the-wall things in comments that were made during the actual event. But as part of that, the name of Jesus was something that this participant had referenced several times, perhaps even pretty strongly. And some of the comments that got made beyond that sounded pretty off the wall to me, and I was just kind of tracking with that. But when the sort of talking about Jesus got roped in, I began to feel like I wasn't welcome here. And I sort of felt myself kind of shutting down in the conversation. And I didn't fly off the handle, but I remember feeling like, you know, these people know I'm Christians. Are they saying they don't want me here? Like, this thing that's really, really important to who I am feels like it's being sort of cast aside here and disparaged. And so for the rest of the call, I just kind of really didn't engage and just sort of shut down and stayed quiet. And as soon as the call was over, I was pretty unsettled. But I just had that kind of like, the penny dropped a little bit. And I was like, oh, this is a sacred value for me. Let me try to rehear that conversation, think about the fact that I'm processing this in a different part of my brain. And like, that's a sacred value because I really believe it. It's not like I was like, oh, you know what? That thing, that's not actually that important. And whatever. But it was like, no, this is really important to me. This is fundamental to who I am. But it's not necessarily for those people. And I don't think they were trying to attack in what they said. They were just sort of like making broader comments. And I actually think that's one of the really helpful things we can do in our work is help different sides of groups realize like, hey, your sacred values in this category, your sacred values in this one. So you can talk about this issue because it's not sacred to you, and you can talk about this, but like if you don't realize you're talking in different categories, it can just make the conversation way messier. So just quickly, as a result, I ended up having a conversation with a couple of those leaders who'd been involved in that to say, hey, here's how what you said came across to me. I want you to understand that like that kind of punched me in the sacred values a little bit. And like, you should be aware of how that felt and how it came across. Not shockingly, the folks I talked to said, wow, that was not our intent whatsoever. Like we didn't realize, we didn't know. And like, thank you for sharing. Like, I now know that differently here after you've shared that. And so I think all of us walked away from that with a better understanding and appreciation for each other, and just sort of how to be thoughtful in the words that we use, and also how to be thoughtful in how we hear conversations that happen. And I just think it's a good example of how our work is not about sort of living in the mushy middle. You hold on to the things you really believe strongly, but you also do that with an intent to hear and give someone the benefit of the doubt and follow, like have the next conversation, clarify, give someone the human opportunity to respond to you, and don't just write them off. And I'm really thankful that they didn't write me off, and vice versa.
Alden,
Yeah, I think, oh, go ahead, Heather, sorry.
I was just going to say, Alden, the part of that story that I really love is after you finished that initial conversation and you felt so strongly about it and you felt hurt and you processed it, you then were able to make yourself vulnerable and going back to them and letting them know how you felt. Because if you walked away at that point, they wouldn't have known that the conversation had done any harm. And they might now moving forward have a little bit of a different conversation, keeping in mind who's in the room and whose sacred values they might be talking about. And I think it's important in the work to remember that, one, we have to evaluate how we interpret the world, but we also have to give other people the opportunity to learn from the interactions. And I just really appreciate that you did that.
Thanks. And just, and I know you had something to say, but I just wanted to give a super quick shout out. Not with the organization anymore, but super quick shout out to Arisa, who is still one of the good ones. And off doing amazing, wonderful things elsewhere. But just that's something that she did for me so early on in my time here with One America. Has helped me realize just even how like little words or things I said or ways I approach things. I mean, everyone on staff did that, but I think Arisa in particular went out of her way several times to have the conversation with me to say, hey, you don't realize how this word, this phrase comes across. Let me explain it to you. And she was a really good friend in that, and continues to be to this day. But we wouldn't be where we are as One America without her. So shout out to Arisa too.
Yeah, shout out to Arisa. I'm gonna send this to her later so she watches. Just so she knows she's loved and missed. But I was just gonna say, I think that your story also kind of speaks to motive misattribution, which is something that we talked about earlier. And I think had you, as Heather said, had you not had that conversation with those two leaders, I think you would have walked away and probably had a negative idea of who those people are or how they thought of you, where those two people probably would have gone on living their life and had no clue. Yeah. So I'm glad that you had that conversation, because I'm glad that you were able to move forward. And now I'm sure that you have positive relationships with those leaders.
For sure.
So I think that what we can call this a learning opportunity, right? So we have someone on staff who I'd like to call an educator at heart. He comes from a education background, and he has really, really encouraged our staff to look at things differently. And I'd like to say that he's been teaching us since he's been on staff. So Ryan Early, do you want to talk about being an in-group moderate?
Yeah, definitely. So an in-group moderate is basically somebody who says to his or her or their own side, hey guys, let's consider the other side, and sort of gets beat up a little bit, or fears that they're going to get beat up by their own group because they want to actually sort of not toe the line and actually reach out and sort of understand what, quote unquote, the other side has to say. And as far as my background, I basically was educated in very liberal cities. I've worked at very liberal organizations. So I've lived in like New York, New England, and DC. And I've also done the Peace Corps, which is also the The volunteers tend to skew very liberal. And so, I lived in an echo chamber, but something inside me always said that you should be listening to what other people are saying and try to understand their argument so that we can advance a cause. So I just noticed that a lot of, I worked in a nonprofit in DC, and I sort of knew the jargon, the language. We all spoke the same language, probably were educated in similar places and lived in similar places. So it just sort of became a gaggle of, nonprofit workers. And I think that, so in that culture, I sort of realized that I couldn't sort of step a toe out of line. And coming into One America movement, I figured that, I want to toe that line a little bit just so that I could feel accepted by the staff, which I obviously already do. And what's really special about the staff is that they also give me an opportunity to sort of not toe a line and sort of cross that line and sort of have us reevaluate our own values and our own assumptions and biases and things like that. I noticed that when I came in, I was like, okay, so I'm gonna have to use these right words so I'm not dismissed. And I think that in larger society, we sort of, especially as a progressive liberal, this side of the spectrum, tends to shun people who maybe use one word out of place or say something a little bit nuanced that the group doesn't get. And so we just sort of shut down the argument. And it's sort of like, you missed the forest for the trees because you are focusing on this one thing and not actually focusing on the larger issue. And so my goal here, and one of my things that I do in my personal life, is to sort of challenge the staff to think about how we communicate and what biases we have as a nonprofit organization based out of DC, who has progressive liberals on staff. What are some of the things we're missing? What are some of who are some of the partners we're missing because we sort of, speak this jargon and live in this liberal progressive world sometimes personally. And as an organization, I think we could prosper if we reach across and maybe get funders or partners or just network with organizations that a nonprofit like us or nonprofits in general or progressive liberals probably wouldn't typically reach out to. So I know I sent an email out about the letter. The letter was signed by many authors and creatives in the US and abroad, basically asking for open debate, because we know that some of the things, let's say about racial justice that we talked about earlier, you sort of have to toe the line if you want to be accepted in the club, unless you want to get some DMs fighting you or, be on, basically be fighting all the time online. So I think open debate is one of those things that we should embrace. And I challenge the staff to just think about any assumptions and biases that we have so we can see the other side, so we can program and form partnerships with people from the other side. And also just be more inclusive, because not everybody's a progressive liberal on staff. And so we just want to make sure that we are, when we speak and have meetings, that we're actually including everybody and hearing everybody and sort of challenging ourselves to sort of step outside our bubble for a little bit.
And I appreciate that challenge. And I think I want to thank you also, because it's not easy to be an in-group moderate. I think when you're coming into a situation where a culture has already been established and you're challenging that or challenging how we might approach certain things, that is it takes a brave person to do that. So I appreciate the fact that you've done that. Do you guys have any stories where you've had to kind of serve as an in-group moderate to get people to see things differently or look at things from a different perspective?
I actually think about that a lot for myself, especially in the way I conduct myself online, because kind of going back to the sacred values point, one of the things that I hold really dear is that all people should be in. Every single person is in with me in the circle of, in my worldview, in God's circle. Everyone is invited in. So when I start drawing lines saying, well, you're too conservative, or you're too, you don't get it on this issue or that issue, and so you're out and you're out and you're out, so that I can kind of stay with my liberal progressive bubble, then I'm actually denying that sacred value for myself. And so I often find myself trying to be my own in-group moderate, I guess, to make sure that I'm kind of checking myself about those same issues that you described, Ryan, because I do tend to kind of swim in those waters and want to be able to kind of just frame situations in a context of being more inviting and more inclusive than what sometimes we do.
Definitely.
It's like you have a little in-group moderate on your shoulder, which we could sell on,
which operates my toxic polarization barometer.
Exactly. Yeah.
Oh my God! Check out our merch store, everybody.
Yeah. It'll be ready in a few months.
Coming soon.
Yeah, I found myself being an in-group moderate recently. Well, it's interesting, right? I mean, the part of what we've seen with the vision around coronavirus is that a lot of people have taken very black and white stances, right? And I mean, I heard someone say the other day, well, this politician said we should do X, so therefore I'm just against it, just based on that. And I'm like, is that a good way to actually, like, can we have some complexity and nuance? And so I find myself often in conversations where people say, this person's doing a terrible job, and I'm like, yeah, they are. And they're like, and this is a terrible thing, and I'm like, yeah, it is. And they're like, and this stat says this, and I'm thinking, no, that stat doesn't say that. So even that feeling of like, I agree with you, and then no, I don't want to go that far, right? Makes me feel perpetually like an in-group moderate, which is sometimes it can be tiring, but it's important. It's really important.
It's very, very important. And I think, as I mentioned, it's risky, especially when you're trying to be an in-group moderate to people that you love and care about. And it's almost like you're stepping out and being almost like you're being vulnerable to people who may judge you and who may look at you differently after you come out and say what you need to say. But I think it's important because even if they don't listen to you right away, you've still planted a seed. And maybe after that seed is planted, they'll start to grow into a more understanding person.
I think that's an amazing point. And I just want to add one thing to it, which is that, yes, like you planted a seed, and even if they never listen to you, the person over here who has been silent this whole time, who thought nobody else feels the way I do, that this isn't right, they heard you, and they may now feel the courage to step up with you. So I think that's right on.
Heather, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Were you getting ready to say something?
I was going to say just what you said, just this idea that it is scary, right? So in-group moderates, they're kind of heroes. They have to be brave and courageous on their own. There are a lot of folks, myself included, who I love social media. I'll consume it all day long, but I am not going to be that person who's brave enough to come out and say the thing. And it's something that I wish I would like to grow as a human, to be able to be firm enough to say these things. But to Andy's point, there are a whole slew of people who are just consuming information. And we know that the most extreme voices are often the loudest. And we know that the algorithms tend to lift up voices that are more extreme and more wild and more interesting to the storyline. But there are a whole group of people who are watching and reading the comments and reading the conversations. And when somebody is brave enough to stand up when things are not quite right and to say the thing that needs to be said and to be that moderate, like Andy said, it serves a whole lot of other people as well.
I think.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say something I really appreciate about Ryan's story and sharing it is, I think something that can get lost in the shuffle of the in-group moderate thing is you have to start with yourself. I think we all love the idea of being the hero. We all love to say, if you transported me back such and such years ago to whatever bad thing happened, I would have been the one who was different. Well, you're a social creature and you kind of do a lot of things like the people around you who are similar to you. So would you really have been that different? And so I think in whatever scenario, you don't start with, I want to be the hero who stands up and says X, Y, Z. You start with the person who looks in the mirror and says, what's my problem in this situation? Where am I at fault? Where am I falling short? Where am I doing the things that, and like, you also need other people to point out your blind spots that you can't see just looking in the mirror. But I think that that's a really important piece. And I love that Ryan shared about how he's done that in his own life, and that has fueled him to help do it for others. And I don't want to I want to make sure that point doesn't get missed, because I think we love the idea of being the hero, but we don't love the idea of looking in the mirror.
Oh wow, that's powerful.
Yes, Alden is he's a writer, so he knows he's good with the words.
I was like, let me write that down.
But no, I agree. I think that was really powerful, and I think that kind of goes. I think that applies to all of these science concepts. We all, with everything that we've talked about today, we need to start with ourselves first. And I think that's kind of the common theme with all of our stories. We've all had to look at ourselves first and think and reflect and figure out, am I judging the situation the wrong way? Did I hear this wrong? Did I hear this right? I mean, all of these things start with us. And then from there, we're able to plant positive seeds. And you're right, maybe people don't hear us, but the next person might. So yeah, I'm really glad that we were able to have this conversation and be honest with each other and talk about how we've experienced polarization in our lives, because it happens to everybody. And I'm so grateful for all of you for participating today. I've had a really, really awesome time.
Thank you, Anna.
Yeah,
Thank you. Great job.
Anna.
Thanks. But before we head out, I do want to remind everyone to check out our website, www.oneamericamovement.org. You can also find us on Facebook at One America Movement and on Twitter at @one__America. Make sure you guys join us next week for a super special 1-hour episode of Candid Conversations featuring Maya Bialik. Some of you guys might know her as Amy Farrah Fowler from the One America Movement, from the Big Bang Theory. Some of you may know her from Blossom, but Maya is actually a trained neuroscientist in real life, and she'll be sitting down with Andy to discuss the science behind toxic polarization. So make sure you guys tune in. I'm gonna say this at the risk of sounding super corny, but it's going to be a big thing of a time, so tune in. Until then, I hope you guys enjoy your weekend. See you next time.
Have a good weekend.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Yeah, have a good one.
Bye.